I thought I'd read a little bit of two pieces. One because I don't actually write horror, although sometimes I write horrifying things. So in honour of tonight, I'm going to read. Since I don't write horror, I just thought I'd end the world again in it. But this one's another one that I'm reading from this collection. This is called Metro Winds. So there was a girl, young but not too young, a face as unformed as an egg, so that one could not tell if she would turn out to be fair or astonishingly ugly. She was to be sent to a city in another land by a mother and father in the midst of a divorce. The one thing they could agree upon was that the girl should not be exposed to the violence they meant to commit on their life. There was a quality in her that made it impossible to do the ravening that the end of love required. She must be sent away, the father had said, in civil but forbidding tones. For her own good, the mother agreed. My sister will have her. The girl stood between them, wordless and passive as a bolster, as it was arranged that she be sent to the city where her mother had spent her childhood. This girl, who had lived on a remote coast of a remote land in a solitary yellow house, listening to the chilly, grey sea that rushed straight from the ice pole to pound on the shore beside her bedroom window. Red-nosed and blue-lipped, bare-armed and bare-legged, in a faded shift, she had played amongst rocks where crabs scuttled through pools of clouded sky. But on the day of the departure, she wore a navy blue dress and a jacket lined with grey silk, dark stockings and patent leather shoes, all of which had been purchased from a catalogue. The heavy mass of silken hair had been wetted and bound tightly into two braids. She watched her white shift being folded into a dark boxy suitcase, although the mother and aunt had agreed that once she arrived, she would be provided with a wardrobe befitting her life in the city. She can't go with nothing, the mother murmured to herself as she closed the mouth of the case. There was little enough in it, yet how could she be blamed for the lack of clothes or beloved toys to pack, much read books? The girl could not be forced to have accumulated such things. The mother glanced at the girl with a pang of unease as she straightened, but reminded herself that the child's destination was a very old and sophisticated city, not some dangerous wilderness, so what need was there for anxiety? She wanted to cup the girl's face and kiss the cheeks and eyelids tenderly, but only rested her hands lightly on her shoulders, felt the fragility of them, noted absently that her own fingers were stiff as dried twigs. You will see, she said vaguely. There was no need to invoke good behaviour, for the girl was calm and biddable, and remarkably did not practice deceits. When a question was asked, she saw only that the information was required. The consequences of her answer or the uses to which the information she gave might be put did not concern her. Being asked, she told. If she did not know, she said. This might have made her blunt and tactless, but she seldom spoke unless asked a direct question. What would the girl's aunt make of her, the mother wondered, rather than leaving her plump sister embittered? The lack of a husband or children had softened the centre of her until she was sweet enough to ache your teeth. She had been full of delight at the thought of having a vessel into which she could pour the rich syrup of her emotions. I shall adore her and she will be happy, she had written. The mother frowned at the memory, for it seemed to her that the girl was too deep and odd to be content with mere happiness. Once, seeing a storm brooding, she had gone seeking the girl, only to find her standing at the edgy rim of the sea, hands lifted to the bruised clouds, like a child wishing to be taken up. What sort of child is it who wishes to embrace a storm? She had wondered in appalled awe. The girl's lips had been drawn back from her teeth in a rictus that looked at first to be an expression of pain, but was only what laughter had made of her. Even so, one could not say to one's sister that the child had a capacity for rare and frightening joy, and so she had simply agreed that they were bound to get along. That at least might be true. Stowing the case in the boot of her car, the mother thought how often over the years she had tried to convey her disappointment in the girl in letters to her sister, who had only congratulated her on her good fortune with extravagant wistfulness that left no room for a confession of the fear that she had borne not a flesh and blood child with fits of ill temper that must be humoured and fears that must be soothed, but a sort of angel, and not the soft, fat, promiscuous angels of Italian frescoes, but a wild, untamable creature of dry feathers and blazing sunlight and high wailing winds. Neither the mother nor the father thought of the girl with intimate possessiveness. It was not the man's nature to wish to possess anything other than abstract ideas, for he was a doctor and a medical researcher. And the woman found it impossible to love a child who required neither forgiveness nor tolerance. A mother needs needing, she told herself, to excuse the guilt that churned in her belly from time to time. The girl sat docilely in the car on the way to the airport, hands folded loosely in her lap. "Are you afraid?" her mother asked after they checked the bag in and learned the seat allocation. "No," the girl said simply. The mother swallowed an aimless spurt of anger, knowing that for anyone else being sent into the unknown would be reason enough for fear. Perhaps the girl had nothing with which to people her nightmares because she lacked imagination. The mother felt a shamed relief when the time came to say goodbye. Yet at the same time it seemed to her there were words that should be said. "I should understand something," she thought urgently. When the girl turned to pass through the door to international departures, the woman found herself remembering with sudden shocking clarity the lumpy slipperiness as the midwife pulled the child from her womb and swung it up onto her flaccid belly, the rank animal stench of the fluids that flowed out of her, and the purplish swollen look of skin smeared with white foam and strings of bloody slime, that black hair and the dark bottomless eyes that looked through her skin and into her soul. The airport doors closed with a smooth hiss, severing them from one another. The woman stood for a time, looking at the ambiguous smear of her face in the dull metal surface, feeling grief, longing, fear. I might just stop there and go on to reading the one that I decided to read for this particular chapter. This one, I wanted to end the world, but differently, not with a whimper and not with a bang, but somehow serenely, if that would be possible. And I'm so scared of bloody dying that the thought of the world ending is just like a big death to me. So to try and write this was something else. This one's called Grigori's Solution. And I have to read it in the voice that I hear in my head, which is an old man. It might as well have been magic, for all that people could understand of how it worked. Mathematics at an exalted level is a kind of magic. If the fateful sum had been set down in all its inexorable and deadly perfection in the Middle Ages, it would doubtless have been regarded as a spell, and like as not the young savant who penned it would have been burned at the stake. And it is not a spell, and is it not a spell, in the sense that magic spells were traditionally, are still, I suppose, for one who believe in such things against all modern rationality, words of power, that is, words, or in this case, numbers, which when said, effect physical change. To the Middle Ages, magic was not a game to engage and enliven the imaginations of children, nor a literary device for writers too lazy to grasp the nettle of reality. It was regarded as a darkly potent force that might be tapped, though never without consequence. This is not the Middle Ages, and yet in the sense that the labelling of a thing as magic is a primitive means of surmounting fear, it may be reasonable that some people prefer to call that dreadful sum that has been writ magic, since it will effect the greatest change of all. It will unmake existence. Despite everything, it gives me a little shiver to write those words down in my notebook. How heavy and cold they seem, how inexorable, and how strange too to discover at the tail end of a life full of earnestly penned words the unimaginable extent of the power that can be contained in the markings I had hitherto only seen as the bearers and vessels of meanings. I am like a child discovering the building rods he has played with for so long are sticks of dynamite. That I heard of the sum as early as I did was by sheerest chance. I had just settled into my room here at the Olympus, dispensing my few items of clothing from suitcase to wardrobe, when I was inescapably reminded of all the times I had waited by by the telephone in anonymous hotels abroad for a call from an interview subject or contact. It's odd how, viewed in retrospect, a life full of busyness can begin to seem rather empty. Perhaps this is why I had a sudden sentimental impulse to hear English, and as the phone I had purchased had an application that allowed me to tune into radio stations anywhere in the world, I searched until I happened on an English voice. It was the host of a late-night science program coming out of Boston, and it did not take me long to discern that its main aim was not to present science, but to turn science into that spurious thing, entertainment. The invited guests were the sort that spoke sensationally, and none too clearly, of the more speculative ends of science, and the sloppiness of intellect displayed by the host was acutely irritating. I was on the verge of shutting the application when a new guest, a young Scottish mathematician, began to speak with refreshing doggedness about something the host called the doomsday formula, but which the young man urgently insisted was the resolution of a mathematical problem he called Grigori's solution. He was clearly upset about some aspect of the solution, but he lacked the slick patter and practiced urbanity of the other guests, and his conversation was very technical. Nor was he entirely clear about the sum that was the centre of his disquisition, for, as he frankly admitted, the math involved was far beyond his considerable ability. The host soon lost interest, for he could not persuade his guest to agree that the completed sum could be applied to the creation of some sort of weapon of mass destruction. Indeed, all the young man would say was that the sum itself was the thing to be feared, before again launching into labyrinthine mathematical explanations. The host managed to silence him by the simple expedient of cutting him off mid-sentence with a song, having no notion that the end of the world had just been announced on his trite show. I had no idea of the magnitude of what I was hearing either, but I had heard enough to want to know more. It may be, indeed, that I was the only person listening with the right combination of an understanding of pure math and a love of philosophy to have been capable of getting some inkling of what the sum might be. It took a little time and effort to get the telephone number of the station, and by the time I called, the receptionist informed me the mathematician had left. Indeed, he had left before the program ended, she added disapprovingly. I managed to extract his name and the information that he had an American wife, lived in Charlottesville, and had left in a cab. I eventually tracked down his home number, but by then it was the middle of the night in the States. I called at what seemed to me a reasonable hour the following day, only to be told by his wife that he had flown to Australia directly after the program. He had been scheduled to fly there the following week to deliver a paper at a conference, but he had altered his flight to leave earlier. Garrulous by nature, she did not have to be coaxed to tell me that her husband had been in Boston to deliver a series of lectures when the opportunity had been arisen to appear on the science program. He was not normally interested in that sort of thing, but he had learned something in Boston that had got him tremendously excited and upset, and he had told her that he felt the need to let people know about it as swiftly as possible. She had no more notion that the science show host what had got him into such a state. But she said it was connected to a problem that had been solved by a young mathematician in Estonia. She had no idea how her husband had learned of the Estonian mathematician, or why his solution was of a sum should have prompted her husband to speak on the radio, then fly to Australia early so that he could consult with colleagues in Adelaide, or was it Melbourne? She thought it was Adelaide, but she had no way to reach him because the poor darling had left his mobile behind in Boston. The radio program had called her about it after his hasty departure. An email address, I suggested rather hopelessly. She gave it to me, but said her husband was unlikely to check his emails until he reached his hotel in Brisbane. Before I rang off, I got the address and phone number of the hotel and the date of his arrival. I have thought of that friendly, foolish woman more than once in the last few days, for like much of the world, her easy scorn of mathematics must have seemed cruelly short-sighted in the face of the fact that humanity will face its demise at the hands of a sum. Or perhaps she and all those despisers of math merely feel vindicated in their loathing. At the time when I disconnected, I wondered a little at my compulsion to speak with her husband. After all, I had heard only a little of the net math of the sum, rendered by someone who, admittedly, who, though a renowned mathematician, had admitted his own inadequacy. And how should a matter of world-shaking mathematical significance be announced on the radio in such a manner in any case? No one would think of announcing the cure for cancer that way. There would be a long period of testing, peer assessment, and then the results would finally be announced in some dignified way from some reputable platform. Dismissing the matter from my mind, I told myself I had fixated on it because I was low in spirits. My disrupted circadian rhythms were affecting my sleep and appetite. With this in mind, I took a long, pleasant walk and then ate sardines in a rooftop tavern before finding the doctor whose name I had been given to deliver to him my medical papers. But even sitting in the doctor's office, listening to him talk tediously of palliative care and what would have to be done in this or that exigency, and of the need to consider removing myself to Athens at some critical moment, the memory of the math I had heard recurred in my mind in the strong Scottish brogue of the young mathematician. I was struck anew by his dogged seriousness, despite the host's attempts to persuade him into levity, and the fact that he had suddenly flown to Adelaide to consult with colleagues. By dusk, which I observed from a small piazza on the very tip of Ear, having taken the bus there, I had begun to tweak the threads of my old network of journalistic connections. Those editors and sub-editors and journalists who still lived were retired, and having the luxury of time, or so it seemed, we enjoyed dissecting and lamenting the state of modern journalism, the way it had aided and abetted the rise of corporate capitalism, before I finally laid the few pieces of my inquiry before them. Most were bored enough with their leisure to be intrigued. It was not 2 days later that I began to receive increasingly incredulous confirmation that the sum I had heard in part had been solved, not by the brilliant young European mathematician with a bad haircut that I had envisaged, but by a boy of 15 living on the outskirts of a genteel Boston suburb, a mathematical savant called Grigori. But he had not come up with the problem. That had apparently been the doing of an elderly spinster, a retired math teacher, herself an immigrant who had been attempting to solve it for 30 years. The news of the sum was beginning to leak out into the incredulous wider world, driblets and drops of it at least, but too little for anyone to clearly understand its significance. In my opinion, it took the math and scientific community an unnecessarily long time to recognize and accept what had been done, let alone to break the news to the world at large. They are not entirely to blame, of course. Mathematicians and scientists are notoriously unable to communicate clearly, especially with the non-mathematical or scientifically inclined mind. And the lay mind is guilty of too readily closing itself to anything requiring more than basic digestion. I did not understand myself what had been done until after I had finally spoken to the Scottish mathematician, Hugh MacLeod. Ironically, after all my attempts to reach him, it was he who called me, and as if continuing a conversation that had already been going on for some time, told me that the math of the sum and its solution were quite simply too advanced for him and his Adelaide colleagues, for all their brilliance and eminence, to fully grasp. But it definitely involved some sort of groundbreaking force of reversion. Unable to help himself, perhaps, he launched into a description of math so esoteric and complex as to be completely incomprehensible to me. Perhaps sensing my bewilderment, he suddenly broke off and apologized for taking so long to call me. He'd got several belated messages from me only the previous night. He had done so, he told me, in order to return to Charlotteville, to his wife and small sons. He advised me to repair at once to my own loved ones, if I was not with them already, for in a very short time, no one would have the luxury of choosing where they would meet their end. I did not bother to tell the mathematician that I had no loved ones, and that I had already made my choice about where I would meet my end. In truth, I supposed he was making some sort of awkward joke whose point eluded me, so I simply thanked him and asked him to tell me about the retired math teacher. Her name, it transpired, was Adolphine. He had got it and her phone number from a piano tuner who worked in the evenings as a doorman at the hotel where he had been put up in Boston. Discovering Hugh was a mathematician on the way to the 10th floor in an elderly and very slow elevator, he had shown a picture on his phone of the sun on a battered old blackboard, asking if the mathematician could make head or tail of the thing like that, or was it just gibberish? He had taken the picture on impulse. Is that time? On impulse, during a break from tuning an old woman's piano. He explained, maybe it really is time. Is it time yet? Okay, must be the ghost. I tried to question McLeod about his conversation with her, but he cut me off, suggesting I speak to the woman directly, not that it would make any difference. I was pondering this aside when he said in his brusque, kind way that I had better call right away if I was serious about wanting to speak to her. Then he hung up. Somewhat bemused and rather unsettled, I called at once. Adolphine answered, and to my question about her unusual but charming accent, offered the information that she was native Flemish Belgian. In impeccable if accented English, she went on to add that as she had told the Scottish gentleman and the Australians who had called, the sun photographed by the piano tuner had not been created by her, but by her deceased grandfather. He had spent 30 years attempting to prove Fermat's last theorem and had been on the verge of it when the British mathematician Andrew Wiles succeeded. Her grandfather's outrage had been apoplectic, and he suffered an immense and catastrophic stroke that deprived him of his voice, some of his motor functions, and temporarily his wits. She could not say, Adolphine told me softly, if her grandfather had known what he was doing when he scrawled the sum in the aftermath of his stroke, for he had seemed to her to be possessed of mindless rage. Certainly later, when he had regained his wits, he had no memory of composing the sum and pronounced it unresolvable quackery. Yet he never erased it, and sometimes she would come upon him studying it. I always felt it was not that the sum was nonsense, but that I had not the wit to understand it, Adolphine added gravely. I think my grandfather felt the same. It was as if some other, darker, more brilliant part of him had been released to a brief life by the stroke, and that part of him composed the sum. Although she had accepted her grandfather's assertion that the sum was nonsense, the maths she could understand was flawless, and so she had taken the blackboard upon which it was written after his death and set it up in the large ground room where she kept her piano. She too had found herself drawn to study it from time to time. You see, I had begun to have the queer notion that it was a philosophical problem formulated as a mathematical problem, she told me, and that if I studied it long enough, I would understand it. I asked how the sum had come to be completed, and she answered that one day a woman brought a boy to her for evaluation. She had been gardening, so instead of bringing them to the flight of steps at the front door, she brought him through the piano room so she could exchange her gumboots for house shoes. All the way, the boy's aunt volubly proclaimed him gifted and not unteachable, as the school insisted. It transpired that she was seeking the grounds to force the local school to allow her to enroll the boy, to avoid keeping him home or spending the considerable funds that would be required to send him to a special school. Although the gentle Flemish woman did not say it, I fancied Adolphine had disliked the aunt, who had complained at length about the cost of feeding the grossly overweight boy and lamented being saddled with him after her sister and Estonian brother-in-law had been killed in a car accident. Given her clothing and jewelry in the car she drove, it was evident the aunt had been making full use of the boy's inheritance, and Adolphine conceded that it was quite possible she had spent it all. In any case, as the two women spoke, the boy wandered back down the piano room. When they found him, he was at the blackboard, furiously scratching numbers and letters with tiny nub of chalk. Adolphine, intrigued, prevented the aunt from disciplining the boy and erasing his so-called gibberish, giving the boy a fresh stick of chalk and suggesting he remain with her until they saw what he did with the numbers. The aunt had been elated to be able to get rid of Grigori for a time without contravening the conditions of the will that he stay in her care. Not the least bit repelled by the boy's physical grossness or his emotional reticence, Adolphine had been genuinely curious to discover what he would do with the sum, for she had been able to see that he grasped the truth, the math, immediately. The stay of a night had become several nights, and then had become a long-standing arrangement where the boy spent a certain number of hours a day and some nights with Adolphine. He had been attending her for some months before completing the formula, which he had been working on steadily since that first day. He had gone far beyond her knowledge of math, and although the boy seemed to have no further interest in the sum once it was solved, she had tried to interest the local university mathematicians in coming to see it. She had not succeeded and given it up, and then by chance a photograph of the blackboard taken by the piano tuner had been shown to Hugh MacLeod. Adolphine's voice was warm when she spoke of the Scotsman who had phoned her, initially in excitement. He had been excited, saying that he thought some of the boy's math was so original that it might involve a new number. Not that Grigori would be much impressed by fame, and my grandfather has gone beyond the care of such things, Adolphine told me sadly. The boy's great displeasure was to sit with her on her porch swing and drink her homemade lemonade. That was what he wanted to do each day when he set down his chalk. Once he had finished, he had also asked, how much am I getting near the end? Okay, I'll just finish this paragraph. I thought we might contrive for him to remain with me for a week or so, and that seemed to content him, she said. He did not blame the boy any more than Adolphine did. Indeed, she had a strange theory about the sum and the boy's solution to it. She told me in our last conversation that Grigori had reacted to her grandfather's equation when they passed by the board that first day, almost as if he perceived it as having a physical force. He flinched, she said wonderingly, as one might flinch from a cry or a slap. She added that she supposed at the time that he had been frightened by the looming blackness of the old board in an age of pristine whiteboards, but she had thought of that reaction since, having noticed that Grigori always approached the board crabwise, leaning into it, rather in the manner of someone walking into the teeth of a storm, right up until the sum was concluded. Then the boy had straightened for the first time and regarded the sum at length, very intently, before at last heaving a great sigh of relief and setting down his chalk. It sounds silly and fatuous, but I can't help but feel that Grigori had been trying to solve my grandfather's equation of rage ever since he saw it in order to silence it, Adolphine said. And I'll stop there. Thank you.